Good afternoon and good morning to many of us. My name is Adam Kendall, and I will be giving a presentation today. John, Most Worshipful John Cooper, past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of California, will be introducing me today and also be my discussant. So I'd like to turn it over to him.
Thank you, Brother Adam. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Adam's background and then just a brief preview of what we're going to be treated with today. Today, we have a presentation by Brother Adam Kendall. Adam is the editor of the Plumb Line, the quarterly bulletin of the Scottish Rite Research Society, and is currently the second vice president of the Philadelphia Society. A past master of San Francisco's Phoenix Lodge number 144, and also Northern California Research Lodge, he is a full member of Quatuor Coronati Lodge number 2076 in London, England. He is contributing to the editorial committee for their annual transactions as well, Ars Quatuor Coronatorum. And additionally, Adam is the Quatuor Coronati Correspondence Circle Regional Secretary for the United States and Canada. He is a past master of the Masonic Library and Museum Association and a former collections manager for the Henry Wilson Coyle Library and Museum at the Grand Lodge of California. Adam has been a frequent speaker at local and international symposia, as well as a historical consultant and interviewee for Masonic-related documentaries. His research has been published in the European Journal of American Culture, the Journal for Research into Freemasonry and Fraternalism, for Hayam, and several other publications. In 2019, he received a Master of Arts in History from California State University, Los Angeles. I think you will find his topic, Fraternal Frontiers, Reconstructing the Life of Benjamin Hayam, California's third Grand Master, to be a most interesting one. The story begins with the conquest of California in the war with Mexico in 1846, and has as its background the California Gold Rush, which brought thousands and thousands to the gold fields of California beginning in 1848. The opening drama of the story takes place in San Francisco, a booming frontier setting, and the key figure in the story is California's third Grand Master. So sit back and enjoy the story which is about to unfold. Adam.
Thank you, Most Worshipful John. This is a project, obviously, that has become very near and dear to me. I'm going to share my screen real quick, and we will begin the slideshow. This is a biographical tale, largely, but I also, inspired by both Dr. Susan Summers' presentation and also John Belton and Andrew Prescott's, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I put it together and reconstructed it, because most Masonic biographies, as we know, are largely hagiographic. They only tell the high points and all the great things that these people have done, and they always stop short of when this person stopped or ceased being Grand Master. We never really hear about what they really did. Benjamin Hyam, for those of you not from California, and there are many here, is an enigma and nearly forgotten to most California Masons, except for a few. I like to joke that many of the rules we have in Freemasonry in California are due to Hayam. He was multifaceted, a very complex character, and if you were to read the narrative about him, you would think that he was not a very good man. But he was like most people, there was a mixture of goodness and also of fault. He could certainly be a tragic figure, and he certainly did make some mistakes in his life. So Hayam is complex for the fact that he pushed the envelope on the powers of a Grand Master. And at this time in California, it was a fledgling jurisdiction. composed of many different Masonic jurisdictions. Some of the earliest were from Washington, D.C., from Missouri, from New Jersey, and elsewhere. Hyam, however, came from a different background, a much different background. And so this background created some problems for him as well. He was our first foreign-born Grand Master, very prideful, and like I said, he pushed the envelope of the power of his office. His fascination with the power associated with Freemasonry was a likely motivator for him. We have to understand that during this time, like any kind of, it was like a civic religion, any high-positioned individual would ultimately bend the knee to a Grand Master. We likely don't think of the Grand Master in these terms back then, but Hayam certainly embraced this idea. So his fascination with the power motivated him and led to his involvement in several different power clubs, such as the Rite of Memphis, which for some of you might be an enigma as well. It was definitely a power club at this time. Likely not very for the esoteric leaning as it's become known as, but for those who had already been coroneted with a 33rd degree or had served as a served as a Grand Master. His attraction to controversy was the result of his pride, but it underscored his belief that he was right and that he was likely correcting injustices and also satisfying his sense that he was shepherding men in a very important time, which was early California. But to go understand him a little bit more, we have to go back to his, let's see if I can get this. This is an undated photograph of Benjamin Daniel Hyam, third Grand Master of California. He was born in 1813 in London, England. And at age 12, his family, who was of Jewish descent, emigrated to Kensington, Jamaica, which is just outside of Kingston. We don't know a lot about him except for secondary sources. But he studied to be a physician, and he also read law. But he ended up being a clerk for a plantation for the Englishman Robert Smith, and owing to the similarity in names, likely married his daughter, Anne Smith. So during this period, 1840s, he entered into the United States Army, fighting on the side of the Americans during the Mexican-American War, which lasted until about 1849. This war, to give a little bit of background, erupted over disputes over territories in Texas and eventually gave the West to the United States. Several states that we know today, Arizona, parts of New Mexico, Nevada, and California, all were the result of the Mexican War and the Treaty of Hidalgo. Benjamin Hyam became a Mason in Veracruz, Mexico, in a military lodge that had been chartered by the Grand Lodge of Mississippi. And this lodge operated for a few years, not very long. The Americans were in Veracruz in order to capture the city and march on to Mexico City. They did that, and Benjamin Hyam served as a clerk for the quartermaster and remained in Veracruz until about 1848. After that, this lodge, Quitman Lodge, chartered by the Grand Lodge of Mississippi, turned in its charter and received a new one from the ancient York Masons of Louisiana Grand Lodge. This Grand Lodge is most interesting, and I can't go into very much detail, unfortunately, just as a preface, a late preface, because there are so many instances and intersections of events in Hyam's life that we could easily get into the weeds with these historical events. So you can read about this in detail. Fortunately, this paper will be published at about the first of the year in the transactions of the Quadricornati Boston conference that unfortunately had to be canceled. But we will be publishing the papers of that. So you could read about this in full. This Grand Lodge, however, is very important because it had itself been set up by the Grand Lodge of Mississippi to counter the French influence in Louisiana and changed the tide for Anglo-American Freemasonry. This is a very complex tale. It gets into the Scottish Rite, etc. Michael Pohl has written quite a bit about this subject, because this Grand Lodge, which eventually amalgamated or consolidated with the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, changed the face of that state's Freemasonry forever. Even though the Grand Lodge of Louisiana maintained its original name, the influence from the ancient York Masons, or AYM, altered it forever. So Hayam was a member of one of these lodges. They chartered two in California, or warranted, I should say. One was the lodge that could be set up anywhere where Hayam went, and another one that was later named Davy Crockett Lodge, and that will figure in later on. So we have to question, what was he doing going to California with this warrant? So they warranted a lodge for him to go to California. I suspect that perhaps this lodge was intended to be a bulwark for the AYM Lodge, Grand Lodge, to perhaps, as we will see, set up a new Grand Lodge, under which Hayam would probably most likely be in control. So he and his friend L.A. Besançon traveled to California in 1849 or early 1850, I should say, and arrived there probably in and about January of 1850. Now, California, or I should say San Francisco, had been transformed from a very sleepy peninsula town with a mission and a presidio that had been set up by the Spanish. The Spanish had built these in 1776, but by now, San Francisco was beset with everybody from the world. The Russians had already expressed interest there with trapping. They'd already been there for several years before. The Spaniards and Mexicans were there, but now the French and the English and everybody who knew about California now found a permanent home there as they rushed to the gold fields. This is the dawn of the California gold rush, or at least the high point. Gold was discovered in 1848. Took about a year for the machine to get rolling, and by 1850, everybody went there. You can see the fascination of it in books and stories that young men read. It was a media event. And as you can see here in the slide, you have a very romantic view of the miners striking it rich and waving at a new coming ship. Hayam was a part of that, but he was not interested in gold. Many, like several men that came there, very few women at this time, but several men were there, and you can only imagine the violence that was a result of all of these men being in one place, rushing to go strike it rich. He, like many others, were there to ply their trades or become involved in several of the industries that were erupting around the gold rush, or exploit them for that matter. Several individuals, or at least one we know of, he had bought up all of the shovels and boots and dungarees, etc., that were necessary for mining to be sold at his store at inflated prices. So many capitalized and struck it rich. Hayam, however, was involved in government and community building, and his main interest was Freemasonry, because as soon as he arrived, we don't know how or when it happened, but he obviously knew Robert Semple, who was himself a pioneer, had been part of what was called the Bear Flag Revolt, which was an attempt to oust the Mexican government previously, and was now a politician. He and a few other individuals had gotten a tract of land from a land grant from Comandante Vallejo, or otherwise known as Vallejo, and set up a town called Benicia. So Semple and Hayam were friends, and they went to Benicia and began building what now is the first Masonic Hall in California. So right away, they set up this Masonic lodge, one of the first to be working in California, aside from California number 13, chartered by Washington, D.C., and a few others scattered throughout the territory. Remember, in 1850, early in 1850, California was not yet admitted to the Union. That happened later on in September. Um, Events happen very quickly at this point. Here is the warrant given by John Gage of the ancient York Mason Grand Lodge, listing the people that were to set up this lodge, and it was going to be, known as Pacific Lodge at Benicia eventually. This is the reverse, where it has from L.A. Besançon, Hayam's traveling companion, listing Hayam as the first master because the man originally indicated had died. So they set up, and also here is Robert Seppel's petition to join the lodge at Benicia. He had been previously made a Mason at Davy Crockett Lodge, also an AYM lodge. So they set about setting up this lodge, the first lodge hall, and Hayam quickly goes to Sacramento, he had been corresponding with Masons in that area and wanted to set up a Grand Lodge. This did not go well for him because California Lodge, which was a powerhouse filled with lawyers and other very rich men, did not like it that they had not been contacted about this new Grand Lodge, and basically forced Hayam to restart the process. A month later, they again convened in Sacramento, this time with a full participation of California Lodge, and set up and basically created the Grand Lodge of California in April of 1850. California Lodge was not very happy with Hayam. This was his first run-on with him. This was to color their relationship. It was a very bad relationship. What could not go ignored was the fact that Benjamin Hayam came from, at that time, what was considered an illegal Grand Lodge. Now, why did he become, and his lodge, regular Masons at that time? This is difficult to assess, but likely, and we do know from some secondary sources, that a news had gotten around that the two Grand Lodges in Louisiana were about to consolidate, although they were, the Californians were a little bit suspicious of this. However, they probably felt it was going to happen, and the new Grand Master, Jonathan Drake Stevenson, basically waved his hand and said everybody there present was from a regular lodge. This was out of convenience, probably, because in order to regularize properly in the usual manner, Benicia Lodge, they would have had to have it rechartered under the Grand Lodge of Louisiana and then charter it again at California. So it was probably for expediency. Benjamin Hyam was present as a secretary pro tem. He was eventually elected on that day junior Grand Warden. So he went very quickly, probably made the California Lodge men very upset. However, California Lodge did have the day, and their day. They became California Lodge number one. One of their members was Jonathan Drake Stevenson. He became the first Grand Master, and Benicia Lodge was chartered that day as well under Benicia Lodge number 5. So we have a new Grand Lodge. Here is their charter from April 1850, which was issued a few days after the California, or before the first session of Grand Lodge. So he moves up very quickly in Grand Lodge. We have just of the primary sources, the proceedings from this time. But he is from letters from Benicia Lodge. He does set about becoming a very powerful force in that lodge, and he knows his power and his knowledge of Freemasonry to such an extent. He's a bit pedantic about it, and when he does become Grand Master or Deputy Grand Master, I should say, he's acting in the sense as a Grand Lecturer and also the Grand Master, because his Grand Master had to leave the state, and so he, for nearly a year, in fact, and so he essentially becomes Grand Master before he's actually elected so. The first lodge in Hawaii is chartered under his imprimatur, and he generally makes himself kind of a pain for people, because he goes into lodges and inspects their records and makes his own notations where he feels that there had been a mistake. In his own lodge, he reprimanded his secretary for leaving his chair before getting permission from the master, and made the poor man to write down his infraction in the minutes of the book. So those of us reading it later on can witness his humiliation afresh. This was sort of the man that Hayam was. He was also definitely known for his generosity. There are stories of him giving money to less fortunate. And in fact, our per capita system, monies that are given on top of dues, was set up by Hayam in order to relieve the distress of so many brethren coming into California, and indeed set up the system by which their mother jurisdictions would also help to pay for their accommodations so as to not bankrupt the new Grand Lodge. So he was a very forward thinking, and the per capita would also go towards helping orphans, widows and orphans. And so this would be sort of the precursor to what later would form the Grand Lodge's Masonic homes. So he was philanthropically minded, community-oriented, but also known to be sort of hard to his own brethren. This got him into trouble as Grand Master. What he's most famous for is he set about making a few Masons at sight, which is a Grand Master. It's an old prerogative that a Grand Master would be able to make a man a Mason by dispensing with the usual requirements. He would have to be voted into a lodge, of course, but would go through the degrees in one day, dispensing with the learning of lectures or whatnot. But one such case was the most egregious. It was a man named Henry Moses Lewis, who was rejected by California Lodge Number 1 for transposing his name. This was sort of common during this time, but it usually meant you were running from somebody. However, Henry Moses Lewis, whose name was really Henry Louis Moses, had been recommended to change his name to avoid prejudice because he was Jewish. The man who suggested this name change had been on a boat with him, was a prominent Jewish leader in San Francisco. And indeed, most of the men that knew Henry Moses Lewis knew him very well because Lewis was a trustee of Sheriff Israel Synagogue in San Francisco. Hayam likely knew him, being involved in the very, very tight-knit and very powerful Jewish community of San Francisco. There have been several studies about this community and their accomplishments. It's well worth your own study about it because it's a different sort of community that grew in a way that California was growing, very unique from the rest of the country. And Hayam was undoubtedly a part of this. The men who defended Lewis also were, many of them were Jewish, and were very upset over this oversight. Hayam likely found it to be unreasonable and probably thought that there was a tinge of anti-Semitism involved. So he made, despite the man's rejection, he made the man a Mason at sight. But as one of the accusations would attest, he made him a Mason in a place not consecrated for Masonic use. Hayam himself all but admitted that this was a synagogue. And this also points to a perception of Freemasonry by Jewish members of their link, because their own religion is linked with Freemasonry. It had a special attraction to them. And also it was a way in which they could actually participate in civic affairs when they were barred from most other avenues, political avenues. So this points to larger perceptions of, wider perceptions of Freemasonry within minority religious communities. Moving on, though, this did not impress California Lodge Number 1. Several other accusations erupted against Hayam of disobeying the gavel of the California Lodge Number 1, cursing at its master, making two other Masons in the Gold Country Masons at sight because they had been rejected due to jurisdictional issues, pedantry, likely that Hayam thought of it. And he was not put on trial, but they held a special meeting to discuss his issues. He happened to be out of town at this time. Unfortunately for him, his wife was ailing. He likely went back to Jamaica. Keep in mind, this man had been in California for several years. He has not seen his family, like many did. They left their families to go do their business elsewhere in California. This is by the Deputy Grand Master Charles Radcliffe announcing the proceedings against Benjamin Hyam. They were to put him on sort of a trial, or a commission was to hear the complaints against him, and the assembled would make a judgment whether or not to request removal from office. The important thing to understand here is California at that time, or the Grand Lodge at that time, did not have any mechanism for impeachment of a Grand Master and removal from office. So they held this trial against him, for lack of a better word. This is a handwritten letter from Charles Radcliffe about Hyam. They're trying to keep this under wraps. There's a whole story about how they eventually did so by republishing the proceedings, not because they were embarrassed about it, although they certainly were. But I've read other secondary sources that suggest that them removing it from the reprints of the proceedings was mostly because it was embarrassing, and most of all embarrassing to Hyam. Unfortunately for Hyam, as we'll see later on, certain details do remain, and what he published at his own expense, his narrative or his defense, was not included, so you never got to hear his side. But he did defend himself, and he, in a very attorney-like way, because remember, he was a lawyer, he refuted every single charge against him, and I might add that it was very successful. He basically showed some of the Masons who were accusing him to be either jealous or hopping on the bandwagon for whatever reason, because the hatred against him was so great. Men he had helped in the past, helped them get their degrees, were actually and had been rejected, turned against him. One of which was a very famous journalist, James King of William, who had later on, a few years later, been assassinated in the streets, and his murder was the impetus to restart the Second Vigilance Committee of San Francisco. So you can see he is interacting with several players in early California history. But he did defend himself. They asked him to remove himself from office, and he said no. And so he just continued on being Grand Master. He left during he was in San Francisco for a few years after that, very proud, listed as a past Grand Master in the city directory. He was a part of the San Francisco's Democratic Committee, reformed it from corruption, and also chased out the Know Nothings, or the American Party, which was a pro-union but anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic organization, sort of a political/secret society. Hyam was a Democrat, which was naturally against the Democrats. For those of you who don't know, were largely aligned with the South in the Civil War, and the Republicans, which came a little bit later, were pro-union, just like the Know Nothings. However, apparently Hyam's party was anti-slavery. So this is very interesting that he's kicking out a pro-union, anti-slavery party. Likely, and he's I've seen some of the paperwork on it, that he is not very happy with their anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic stance, which senses to me, just like the Henry Moses Lewis case, that he doesn't tolerate religious intolerance. This is just a supposition on my part, but I'm sort of reading into it. So he leaves. He eventually joins the army again, but under the Confederate States of America, the Confederates, or the CSA. And he's a clerk, just like he was in the Mexican-American War. He is discharged, and he goes to Memphis, Tennessee, where he becomes involved in the cotton trade with a man named Aaron Van Camp and his son Eugene Van Camp. These two men were Confederate spies. So Hyam, after a bad business deal and his imprisonment for a bad debt, eventually harasses this family and writes secret letters to officials accusing them of espionage or continued espionage. Hyam is put in jail over this debt. It is eventually dismissed because the judge said that both sides lacked credulity. So neither one was to be believed. It's a long case. I've read about as much as I could possibly tolerate. Hayam writes the longest letters. Here's one here where he's writing Abraham Lincoln, proclaiming himself to be a solid citizen and a dyed-in-the-wool unionist. So he's no longer in the Confederate Army. Now he's a unionist, and he's proclaiming his innocence. He is let out of prison. I suspect he went to Jamaica because I discovered in the records he did father what I believe is an illegitimate son. But he eventually moves to D.C. He conducts his business with his second wife. He works for the Freedmen's Bureau, which was responsible for resettling ex-soldiers and slaves on lands that they had lost before, and to afford them general assistance. He also is appearing in New York at this point, and although we don't know when he met Harry Seymour, he becomes an assistant of him. Harry Seymour was an ex-Surnoist, and in fact had been removed from power or kicked out of the Surno Council because he had set up an illegal Supreme Council for the Surnoists. So he's kicked out of an organization that is largely believed to be irregular to begin with. He was kicked out of regular Masonry. We don't know why, but some sources point towards larceny. His former assistant, Calvin Burt, was upset because when Harry Seymour became head of the Rite of Memphis, he followed the trajectory of the Grand Orient de France, who had basically gained control of the Rite, decapitated it, and shelved the higher degrees. Harry Seymour had truncated the Rite of Memphis into 33 degrees, which essentially was a competition with the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite, thus drawing Albert Pike into the conversation, who was most displeased and knew of Harry Seymour and knew of the Rite of Memphis, and basically thought of it as a degree mill, charlatans selling pieces of paper. Calvin Burt moved to Chicago, upset that there were only 33 degrees, and decided that he would confer his own, his own sovereign sanctuary of the Rite of Memphis and confer all 95 degrees. This story figures later on in an addendum. Anyway, Hayam becomes an acolyte or an assistant of Harry Seymour. The Rite of Memphis is a long story. I agree with John Hamill. It's very complex and tortured. I encourage all of you, and maybe we can discuss this later on. I encourage you to find the background on it. It's essentially a high degree system of Egyptian flavor, very popular at one point, but it does have its controversies in France. In the United States, it joins the progression of several other high degree rites that are vying for attention. Obviously, the ancient and accepted rite becomes the most popular in the United States, but it is in competition with it for a few years. In England as well, there's several iterations of it, and the English are none too pleased with it either. But it's brought to the United States in 1856. So I first learned of Hayam's involvement in this from the Neff, which was published in England by Kenneth Mackenzie, who has his own background. All of these people I talk about have their own unique stories, and they all intersect. John Yarker was the head of the Rite of Memphis at this time. He was given patents power by our friend Benjamin Hyam, who, as an assistant of Harry Seymour, went to England, his native England. He's swanning about London, going to the Grand Communication of the United Grand Lodge of England. He's a past Grand Master. People kiss his ring, etc. He is definitely trading off of his reputation, as he was wont to do. It comes out later on through the English press that he has borrowed money from not only New York Masons, but also English Masons when he's in England. He's also given John Yarker, who is a young, esoterically minded Mason who becomes quite famous later on for his books on Freemasonry. He believes in an original mystery to Freemasonry, that it comes from ancient times, and he's in search of the secret. Yarker is a starter doe for the Rite of Memphis becoming involved in several other occult orders, and that's its own story. I will stop there. But the English press rakes Hyam over the coals because not only has it come out that he has financial troubles, indeed, we saw that in his problem with the Van Camp father and son. So they are not happy with John Yarker. They're frustrated with the Rite of Memphis because it's drawing in well-meaning Masons into paying more dues and also thinking that they have higher degrees. The press reveals that Hyam, because they've obviously been reading the California proceedings, they reveal some of his controversies in California. But again, like I mentioned earlier, he does not have any way to tell his side of the story. They hear of him making Henry Moses Lewis an at-site Mason. They hear of the accusation, which was disproved, of him keeping the degree fees. They hear of all of his scandals, but they don't hear from him. And this is undoubtedly a punishing for him. He does return to the United States. He is still involved in committees in the Grand Lodge of DC, but he, in his own native land, is not highly thought upon like he probably wanted them to. He dies. Well, here is a photograph of, or not, excuse me, an engraving of him. Oops, I'm sorry. An engraving of him in his Rite of Memphis regalia. Here is some of the bad press from the English Masonic press here. These are identifying him in the NEF. And here is, I'm sorry, I've gotten ahead of myself. It's so much to talk about. Some of the bad press. He does return back to the United States where he becomes very sick. Since that time, he is suspended for non-payment of dues in his lodge, which nowadays would pretty much suspend you from all of Freemasonry in the United States. But back then it was pretty common that you could remain in good standing in one jurisdiction and be suspended in another. But he is suspended in DC. He becomes ill, and he is in New York City writing his lodge, Benicia Lodge, about his remembrances of his of creating their lodge. Nobody remembers him, so he has to remind them of who he is. And he asks for $250. He's broke. He's got children to take care of. He has 6 children. His wives are dead. And he is alone. This is his plea for assistance. He is in the hospital, Garfield Memorial Hospital in New York City on 1893. He dies and is laid to rest in the United States Congressional Cemetery. So it doesn't stop there, really, because news of his death gets around. And in the Jewish press, one of the most famous writers for the Jewish press in the American Israelite, Isidore Choinsky, or also known as Muftir, that's his pseudonym, or his nom de plume, he writes that Hyam has died, and he recounts all of the good things that Hyam did, which is very nice because nobody really had anything nice to say about him. But it also recounts that he was the first Jewish Grand Master, and recounts that despite the successes of the Jews in San Francisco, he was very bitter about how they were treated and only asked for their money and never got any higher and in rank. And Hyam was the first to kind of break that glass ceiling. But Isidore Choinsky, or Muftir, makes a mistake, and he says that Benjamin Hyam was the first Grand Master of California. This mistake is picked up in the regular press, and he is thereby listed in several other newspapers in San Francisco. And indeed, this mistake is carried into this very day, where you can see on some websites that he is listed as the first California Grand Master. This undoubtedly is shaking the boots of the ghosts of California Lodge Number 1, because remember, they were the powerhouse, they were the first, and the first Grand Master was from their Grand Lodge. So despite all of his pain, despite his indignities, Benjamin Hyam is probably having the last laugh. Now, when I mentioned before of Calvin Burt in Chicago and the Rite of Memphis, who split from Harry Seymour, years ago, I found out from Most Worshipful John that there was some Masonic regalia in an old mining town in the northern districts, northern mining districts. I can't even describe how far it is from here, or from anywhere, any of the cities in California. It's a very much in the mountains of the Sierra, the foothills of the Sierras, very remote. And this old lodge and their historical museum that's in the town has this collar from the 95th degree belonging to a man named Horace T. Persons, who happened to be a Union soldier, had been a prisoner of war, and had resettled himself in Forbstown, California. His letters patent is signed from Calvin C. Burt, former collaborator of Harry Seymour. This gives Horace Persons, in the strangest corner of California, powers to administer the Rite of Memphis in Oregon and the Nevada territories. Only Horace cannot do so because he dies. He had had dysentery, and the treatment for that was opium. And in his obituary, it actually mentions quite clearly that he had died from his medication. So that's a side note, that this weird little rite that's more commonly known as a European rite did have some success as a club for power players. Certainly, Hayam never really had a esoteric bone in his body, and that side of the of that rite probably comes from its founders, and also most certainly from Yarker, who definitely highlighted the esoteric content of the rite, but not Hayam, who, as a power player, likely saw it like many did. He'd already been coroneted with every degree imaginable. He held power in his hands. He had ushered in a new age in California, and he had shepherded men towards that end. So that ends the story of Hayam. However, I put this together through a variety of sources, and we talked about how you did research during COVID. Fortunately, I didn't have to do this during COVID, but it's taken me the greater part of 10 years, and I have more information than I can use that will probably end up in a book. I got a lot of it from our primary sources. Of course, the proceedings can never go unsung. Proceedings, I think, are any Masonic researcher's friend. Sadly, I think that they're ignored sometimes. But this is where you come to find clues, and you start to find these threads. Of course, I had found Hayam's name in the Neff, which is a primary source. But the best mother lode, as I describe it as a mother lode, are the archives that I located at Benicia number 5. Unfortunately, Benicia number 5 lost its charter some years ago, and I was, despite that tragedy, I was able to go through its records, and this is where I found all of these letters, its original charter, its original warrant that I had known about for years, but could never get into the safe. So here was my day, and I photographed as much as I could and began, while I was still working at Grand Lodge, my research, furiously taking notes. And that's from this study I was able to, from my notes I took. I also was fortunate to get onto several genealogical websites who had several, they had an immense amount of records from who I suspect to be relatives of Hayam. I'm now trying to get into contact with them. So I was able to reconstruct his life, reconstruct a timeline, and then from that, I had to branch out and understand his place in all of the events that he participated in: the Mexican-American War, the Gold Rush, the Civil War, all of these things that American historians should know about anyway. But I found it invigorating and unique because I got to see these events, very important American events, and indeed world events, through the eyes of a particular man, one who history is forgotten. But this is important for a historian, is to find a perspective that never existed before through a common person. Even though he was somebody in California, most Americans, and indeed anybody in the world, may say, well, Benjamin Hayam, who? But it's important to see history through the eyes of people. That's why, or common people, that's why biographies are so popular. And that's why I actually am a recent convert to biographical sketches, because they're so important and they can always be improved upon. This is why you have many biographies of a single person, George Washington, Ben Franklin, etc., because new information always comes to light. And from their perspectives, we can see new or gain new insight into these world events. I know this has been a lot to cover. There's so much more that I wanted to say, let me tell you. But I'm going to turn it over to John, because now we can begin to discuss it. Brother John? I think he's muted.
There we go. Thank you.
Let me stop the share here. Okay.
Okay. Well, Brother Adam, that was a very interesting tale involving lots of different parts of it. I'm going to just explain that we have in our recent lectures, rather than the moderator asking all of the questions that are submitted, is to actually hear from those on the presentation. So if you look at your screen on Zoom, you will find that you can raise a hand like I've just shown on mine here. And I will endeavor, with the assistance of our technical director, to let you actually ask the questions of Adam. So while you're thinking of what your question is, I'm just going to ask one question, Brother Adam, about that. It seems that out of sometimes of controversy comes a refinement of what we do in Masonry. And I know that in this controversy in San Francisco about making a Mason at sight of someone who had been rejected in another Masonic lodge caused California to tighten up its way in which Grandmasters could make a Mason at sight. In fact, so much so that between 1852 and 2009, no Grandmaster of our Grand Lodge ever made a Mason at sight. So that was quite an experience. What is our current law in California that was changed as a result of this episode in 1852?
Well, you got me there, because I've briefly looked at it, and I don't see that there was any change. I think that it was, and indeed during the so-called trial of Hayam, they wrote several other jurisdictions, New York and England to be precise, and they wrote back saying, yeah, what's the problem? We've been doing it forever. It is rare, but it is a prerogative. And I think that that was part of the, that undermined their case against Hayam, that there was never anything codified ever, and it just remained so. But as you know, that there were provisions in the California Masonic Code that restricted the powers of a Grand Master, and also, most importantly, gave us the powers to remove him if necessary. But I don't believe that it's very detailed in what normal Masonic crimes.
What I was referring to, just to clarify a little bit there, is my understanding that what Hayam had done was to convene an occasional lodge in the synagogue, right, and to confer those 3 degrees.
Right.
Shortly after that, our Grand Lodge amended its code and said the Grand Master could make a Mason at sight, but 2 restrictions. Number 1, it had to do it in a regular lodge. He couldn't just call together a group of Masons. And then in addition to that, it had to be with the unanimous consent of the members of that lodge present. Right. There was a lot of concern over the years by other Grandmasters that if they tried to make a man a Mason in a lodge, say a prominent citizen, and someone in that rather public process were to raise an objection, that it could be a highly embarrassing situation to the Grand Master and to the Grand Lodge. So that was what I was referring to as a tightening down of our otherwise rather freewheeling idea that the Grand Master could do anything he wanted to do.
And going with what you just said, is it's a like you said, a tightening up. It articulates that which was probably assumed at the time, that they didn't really think that here is a guy that's going to go against the will and pleasure of an actual lodge. They didn't know that he was going to do it in a place that was not consecrated for Masonic use. So they naturally probably assumed that this is just the way it goes. And then later on, we learned that, well, let's articulate that better in our laws, right? It has to be unanimous consent. It has to be in a regular lodge, not in an occasional lodge. And it probably should be in a building consecrated for Masonic use. I want to add, though, that it was said that they tried to get a Masonic hall. I mean, keep in mind, there's not much by way of Masonic halls in San Francisco at this time. They're renting buildings, likely one of them near where the Transamerica Pyramid is today. But they were all in use. And so because Lewis was on the board of trustees of Sheriff Israel, they likely met in the room that the synagogue had been renting.
Okay, well, I see we have one hand raised, and so we don't have crossfire on this. Our technical director, I'm going to call on him to actually unmute the individual who has a hand raised, and rather than my fielding the questions, you're going to have a direct opportunity to talk to our speaker.
Brother, about this controversy of the place of conferring that degree, conferring, making someone Mason by conferment, what could be a better place than a synagogue? I mean, probably the decision at that point of time was by choice, instead of a Masonic lodge, or by not having a meeting room available, maybe by choice, it was considered more Masonic to choose a synagogue to make him a Mason than in a Masonic room. So that was about the first controversy. I mean, just sharing a thought that occurred to me at the moment. And about the other question, I have another question about the Rite of Memphis. How true is the adverse opinion about the Rite of Memphis? Was it, Masons talk about the Rite of Memphis as a spurious order, or they don't talk very highly of the Rite of Memphis. It was not recognized. I don't know about the current status of the recognition in United States. And what is your opinion about the Rite of the Memphis, and especially given the fact that you mentioned that it was a rite open to 33rd degree Masons and past Grand Masters, and what is your opinion about the rite, and what is its current status in terms of recognition and acceptance in the United States? Thank you.
Okay. For your first question, actually stated that it was a place. For the first question, I'm sorry, I went off. I was muted. Hayam actually stated that it was a place most suitable for Masonic use, which indicates he was echoing many of his Jewish community in San Francisco, that because of the linkage or the link between Freemasonry and indeed King Solomon, it's very attractive. In fact, Maftir Isidore Choinsky from the American Israelite was very biting when he said he criticized Anglo-American Protestant Masons as wearing the second-hand clothing of King Solomon. So, but Maftir also was an ex-Mason. He had nothing really good to say about Freemasonry, so he was very embittered. So you have to take that into account. But I found that his criticism was really, really interesting from a early California Jewish point of view. But yes, there's an importance here, and that link. That's a whole nother paper. Tony Fells has done an excellent study on this, Professor Tony Fells, and also Peter Lanchidi, who is here today. I wish I had read his excellent paper, before, while I was doing this study. Indeed, when I come out with the book, if and when, I will definitely include his excellent paper on American Jewish newspapers and Freemasonry. His paper also will be included in the Boston Conference book. So to your second question, though, and if Mr. Lamchidi would like to say something, I'd really welcome him to speak up. For your second question on the Rite of Memphis, the state of the Rite of Memphis here, it's now known in some quarters as the Rite of Memphis Mizraim. Its first 3 degrees there's very little difference between the first 3 degrees and the Scottish Rite in any modern's ritual. So it sounds really titillating when they say it's a Rite of Memphis 3 degrees. It's not terribly different from the other moderns rituals. And that is practiced in South America and also in Italy, to my knowledge, and some other places, maybe in Central Europe. However, in the United States and also in England, it hasn't had a very good reputation because of the controversies with Harry Seymour and Calvin Burt, and also with the supremacy of the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. The Rite of Memphis likely did it to itself here in the United States. It was competing with other organizations, but it also was not that selling degrees or selling patents is unheard of anywhere in Masonry, but its proponents were usually ex-Masons and fly-by-night salesmen. It also, not to demean the Rite, but it also became very important in some in esoteric circles, though. So it has sort of a dual history. It's been maligned, but it also does have a legitimate history within esoteric orders that sort of orbit Freemasonry, but are not Masonic. I think that even though it is a tortured history, I think that maybe a retrospective of the history of the Rite with fresh eyes and maybe some balanced views might be worthwhile. I'm not the one that's going to do that, so anybody else can do that. So that's in the United States, it is not a recognized Rite at all. It was one of those organizations, though, that attracted the powerful. Because remember, the first 33 degrees of the Rite of Memphis are essentially the Scottish Rite. So many of these men had already been coroneted with the 33rd, and so here you're a 95th degree. They don't practice all of them, by the way, either. But so it was a sort of laurel leaf for many in power. And when you look at the names of the Rite of Memphis, especially on the East Coast, you will see many men of power in Freemasonry in the East Coast, past Grand Masters, Sovereign Grand Inspectors General of the Scottish Rite, etc. So that's the long and short of it in the United States. Certainly, it became problematic for the Scottish Rite here, and part of that, was because of its competition with the Scottish Rite. And also that when Albert Pike got involved, very few people could stand up to him when he took notice of something and he wrote a rebuttal. I don't think many of them were answer back after that, because he was very thorough.
I think we have a hand raised, Brother David.
Good morning. Good evening for you.
I guess I'm unmuted now. Yep. Yeah. Hey, good morning, Adam. Thanks for opportunity to listen to this excellent lecture again for the organizers and yourself. My question would be, if I got it correctly, he was initiated in Veracruz, right?
Yes.
And so my question is, didn't his attachment to Mexican brothers have ever influenced his behavior or his decisions or his any kind of decisions within the Freemasonry or in the profane life? So was there any influence, attachment to these feelings that he was kind of connected with Mexican brothers while he was already in the United States, in California?
Good question. A long answer. It's a long answer I have, and I'll try to make it short. Remember that in Veracruz, he was in a military lodge. So it's the American forces. The American forces, because they're warring against Mexico, aren't going to really, I don't think they're there for to make friends with them. And it was basically an American lodge, mostly Anglo-American Protestant men. For the majority of it in these lodges in Mexico. And so I doubt that they had very much contact with the Mexican population. And certainly there's Freemasonry in Mexico at this period. In California, though, it's a different situation. The California, which are descendants of Spain and citizens of Mexico, because of the heavy influence of Catholicism, tended to not bend towards Freemasonry or have a very favorable opinion to it. That still, to me, doesn't mean that there weren't Masons in California that were of Mexican descent, but they were certainly not in California under the California Grand Lodge. There's a sort of a parallel history. However, during this time, I don't think that there were very many. There was an incredible prejudice against different ethnicities. And it certainly would have carried into the fraternal organizations. There was most certainly a ban on Asians, and there was a general distrust of Mexican citizens during this time. So I'm not going to say that there weren't any, but they, under the Grand Lodge of California and after its subsequent statehood, I don't think that there were any. Maybe some descendants, perhaps, but not many at all. So he doesn't really talk about. In fact, that's the world that is sort of lost when you look at early California literature, and especially in Masonic proceedings in California. They don't talk about other people very much, other ethnicities, except for the fact that we do have a large number of Jews in our lodges, and they form their own lodges. We had an Italian-speaking lodge, Speranza Italiano, very early lodge, and also one of our very early foreign language lodges was French, La Parfaite Union, number 17, which one of the members who defended Henry Moses Lewis came from, or would come from that lodge, because Parfaite Union spun off of California Lodge number 1. Also, La Parfaite Union has a Louisiana heritage as well. There's a brother from LPU 17 on this call. He could probably speak to this. And they undoubtedly, their early members knew of the problems with the AYM Grand Lodge and also with their mother Grand Lodge of Louisiana. So there was a sort of conflict that was taken or transplanted to California in a very small way. These conflicts between different ethnicities as expressed through Freemasonry. And that one definitely concerns our LPU 17 and the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. That is a very interesting tale. And it intersects with my tale as well. So that's a long explanation. It's very convoluted. I'm sorry. There's just so much we don't know. And also keep in mind, this is something to keep in mind, that many of our primary sources we are lucky to have, because the 1906 earthquake and fire utterly destroyed the records of the lodges in San Francisco. Many of them were meeting downtown. The temple that we had built in 1861 had been dynamited as a fire brick, was in ruins. Everything, what they could get out of there is what survived. And then the lapse of time, et cetera, things get lost. There's been other subsequent fires, misplacing of records, et cetera, human involvement. So because Benicia was never burned down, these items survived. So we see a different perspective. In fact, one of the artifacts I found there was a melted pistol that had been removed from San Francisco from the fire, and then it lived in Benicia ever since. And so when we brought it back to San Francisco, that was the first time in over 100 years that this artifact had been on San Francisco soil. So anyway, that I digress. I hope I answered your question. I've only been able to rebuild Hayam's attitude towards people by I'm making suppositions about his intolerance for intolerance, only because of the example of Henry Moses Lewis being, another member of the Jewish community there in San Francisco, and also perhaps the rejection of them. Any other questions, ideas?
I saw on our list here, Brother Hugh O'Neill. Have we heard from him yet? Brother Hugh, I think we'll have to unmute you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Thank you.
There we are. Yes.
A very fascinating paper there, Adam. I really enjoyed that. I know very little about American Freemasonry, although I've been a Mason over here in England for quite a long time. My question is, we take a little step back. My question is about this making a Mason at sight. Basically, my question is, what is the point? My reason for asking this is that it appears that this is sometimes done when there's a particularly eminent person who's been earmarked, if you like, for membership, and he is to be made a Mason at sight. And this making a Mason at sight, as far as I can see, is a very truncated ceremonial, only some of the basic fundamental points, and it's really not much of a do, so far as I can see. So yep. There's another part to their being a point. Why is it necessary to bring such an eminent person in and deprive him of the wonder of the whole full initiation ceremony? So far as eminent people are concerned, surely when you come into Masonry, you are on the level. You come in the same disordered way as every other Mason. So again, what is the point? I look forward to your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's something that I think that's sort of a Masonic existential question, isn't it? What is the point? And certainly the idea of making a Mason at sight was invoked at one point during the whole controversy of one-day classes, which was a big to-do a number of years ago here in the United States. But in the case of Hayam and everything else in the United States, the practice itself likely, as you correctly stated, was done for people of great eminence, royals, etc. And there it is. But it finds its expression in Mackey's Landmarks of Freemasonry, which, were published after what Hayam did, proving, at least in the United States, that these ideas had found their way to this soil, probably through, colonial era. Hayam is wonderfully extant in Masonic history and law, and was very aware of making Masons at sight. Like you described, it's a truncated affair. It's perfunctory almost. We don't know if they performed the degrees in full and just kind of dispensed with the in-betweens, or if it was just, here's some words and here's what it means and here's a lecture and, off you go. The problem with it here in this instance is not that the man is on the level and he's being deprived of the glories of Masonic degrees. It's the fact that this man, Henry Moses Lewis, or Henry Louis Moses, as his real name was, had been blackballed. He had been rejected from the lodge because of the to-do with his name. So he had been rejected by the lodge. That alone whether or not that's correct or not, that's immaterial. The lodge rejected him, and the Grand Master said, "No, I do not accept this. I will go against your decision, and I will make this man a Mason at sight, and I will gather to me certain brethren who can help me do that, form the occasional lodge, and he will be a Mason. You know, don't say anything else. It's my order." And that was very intense, considering what the type of person that would join California Lodge Number 1. That's a powerhouse lodge, and so he had already had a history with them, and I think there was a great deal of antagonism. You could see in some of the writings that they, and some of the people that are appointed to committees that may be able to do something about Hayam are people that have run into him before. So I get the sense that there are a few individuals that probably especially did not like him. So he went on record for disobeying the gavel of a master of California Lodge Number 1, of cursing at him. So you can see that there was some acrimony. So with this Mason at sight deal, it is still controversial. I'm sure of it. It's not well understood. It does happen, albeit very rarely. And in this case, it was from the perspective of a Grand Master using powers that he knew he had, but others disagreed or didn't know that he had. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the perspective of it in this case.
Thank you very much, Adam. Yes, that does underline my fears of what can happen. I realise we've just looked at one case there. There may be others which are entirely different and done in a totally different way, and that's absolutely fine. Thank you very much for your answer.
You're welcome.
I'm very happy about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Any others? Please feel free. I know it's a lot to take in. And I apologize. There is a lot of history here that may be unfamiliar to you, but feel free to ask me about that too. I think many people are on mute.
You can raise a hand if you would like to speak, and our technical director will unmute you.
Mm-hmm. Cecil Roger raised hand, and I unmuted her.
Yes, hello everybody. Sorry, I had
hello.
Yes, I can't see you anymore, but I think you can hear me.
I can see you.
Okay. Oh, that's it. Hello now. Thank you very much
Hello.
for this fascinating talk. It was really great learning about Hayam, whom I wasn't familiar with at all. Now, the typical French question, of course, did he have any reaction to the 1877 split with the Grand Orient de France, when the Grand Orient actually replaced the obligation to believe in God with liberty of conscience? Did he hear about that? How did he react to that?
That's a fascinating one. There is no evidence of that. Although I would like to see more, and you've given me a good idea to check that because at this point he's in DC. He's in Washington, D.C., and he was a member of a committee there. Maybe he had something to say about it. I do know, however, what California said about it. And I kind of chuckled because it's not much, but it's sort of telling according to Masonic politics. California at that time had sided with several other Masonic jurisdictions because of the Grand Orient's incursion into Masonic territories in Louisiana. And so they had de-recognized it already previously, a few years previously. So when word came about the business with the holy books, one of the reactions was basically to the effect of, and I'm paraphrasing, but very closely, that's too bad. Well, we de-recognize them anyway, so next business. So there wasn't a big to-do about it. They said, oh, that's too bad. Well, we don't recognize them anyway. Not a problem. And they were probably relieved because it meant more business for them. And certainly at this time, it's a lot of business going on. But it's very funny because you would expect a jurisdiction to have much to say about it, but California did not. So there's the answer.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
But you brought up another thing that your question inspired, is that what did Hayam know about Freemasonry prior to becoming a Mason? And John and I discussed this. He grew up in Jamaica. It's a British colony. Was he exposed to Freemasonry there? Undoubtedly so. But he never became a Mason. He's informed greatly by American Masonry because he becomes a Mason in an American lodge, albeit in Mexico. So, and his understanding of it does point to an American perspective, even though he becomes a United States citizen much, much later on. But his perspective is uniquely American Masonic, because here's another example. San Diego Lodge number 35, because of when it started working as a lodge, it should have had an earlier number or a higher number in the Grand Lodge, but it did not. There's several different tales about why this is so, and none of them are correct, because I found out why. Hayam locked horns with the master of that lodge, who happened to be the first city attorney of San Diego. So you have two lawyers going at each other. But that city attorney, he was also from South Carolina, from an ancients lodge that practiced a slightly different ritual and refused to conform with conducting business on the third degree. And as many of us may not know, or may not know, the practice of meeting on the third degree in the United States came about as a result of the Morgan affair and after the Baltimore Convention. That's a very unique Masonic perspective, and Hayam insisted that they conduct their business on the third degree as was prescribed by California ritual. So Hayam is maybe very well versed in Masonic jurisprudence and in Masonic history. However, his perspective is on that, at least, is uniquely American. So I don't see much English influence, although the powers of the Grand Master, however, is very much from an older world perspective. Anyway, that was a digression, but your question on what perspectives of what other countries were doing led me to that thought. So
thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Hello, Adam. It's Hasu Joshi. Firstly, hello. Firstly, to say your lecture gets better the second time around. My question was really, this was a period of the American gold rush in California as well. How did they know? Because you would have had many Masons coming from all over America to California. How would have they managed to identify Masons who wanted to join lodges? Was there a form of certificates or letters of introductions?
Mm-hmm. Yes, there were. Not to say that there weren't problems with this. So, because you had many people coming. I mean, there were only a few hundred people in San Francisco at the time of the gold rush, and then there was 30,000 pouring in, and many of them from other countries too. We must not forget. So yes, that became problematic because there was an unfamiliarity with certain documents. There was an unfamiliarity with certain Masonic rites. I often lament sometimes that there's especially in the United States, where the rituals themselves sort of run parallel to the territorial identities, the state's identity and states' rights. So there's usually one ritual per state, and it's known as, say, the California ritual, etc. California had many different rituals that could be worked, and one of the lamentations was that it was a Tower of Babel, that in a lodge room you had a man from, a brother from Kentucky and a brother from Missouri, and nobody understood what they were doing. And so that led very early on to the California ritual, the consolidation of rituals into what we now know as California ritual. There was also a movement afoot in order to escape that confusion by forming a Grand Lodge of the United States. Benjamin Hyam was a definite proponent of this idea, as many other Masons during this time were. The actual idea was floated during the Baltimore Convention, etc. So these were the ideas that were helping or attempted to solve the problem that you asked about. Not understanding ritual or not understanding modes of identification or certificates, etc. Certainly, with the AYM Lodge in California, let's bring it back to the subject itself, it would be very hard to identify a Masonic certificate from them. Many of these certificates, as you saw, were handwritten or just printed in a very simple way. California Lodge at that time, number 13, before it had been renumbered as number 1, knew of Davy Crockett Lodge because they're operating in the same territory. And they were very suspicious of them because they sort of understood through the rumor mill that these were not regular Masons, and so they avoided any kind of fraternal contact with them, which is unfortunate because at that time, San Francisco is a place where you would seek out other brothers immediately. And this is why several of them, you could see in their diaries that they started to meet each other very quickly. And it's through the Masonic fraternity that they're doing this. The first master of California Lodge, Levi Stowell, in his diaries, speaks directly to meeting Robert Semple, who is a very big deal at this time. They knew Jonathan Drake Stevenson, the first Grand Master, because he himself is a walking institution himself. He's very wealthy real estate magnate at that point. He had gone early on, I think in 49. He had come out with the New York Regiment and Volunteers for the Mexican-American War, and took command here during the war against the Californios, during the Mexican-American War, was discharged after that, went to the mines, made several $1,000s and invested in real estate in San Francisco. Bang, becomes very wealthy and a power player. And he was a lot older than most of the people there, but he was very distinct and could be seen walking down the street and everybody knew who he was. So everybody starts to know each other. If you were anybody and you were also a Mason, we like to play up the Masonic fraternity very much. But in this particular case, I do think that this is so. I think the Oddfellows also had that same experience. Because of the fraternal currency, they were exchanging ideas very quickly, very quickly.
Thank you.
In fact, Levi Stowell makes a joke about Benicia he mentions, and I'll paraphrase again, to Robert Semple, it's a new kingdom, but everything looks good on paper. But how right he was, and what I wanted to mention is San Francisco, Benicia, Sacramento, all of these are long waterways that lead to the gold fields of the Sierras. They're competing for reputation and business. Benicia has a wonderful port. So does Sacramento. It's further up the rivers. You go through the Carquinez Strait into the rivers, into the San Joaquin Delta. San Francisco obviously is at the Golden Gate. They're all port cities. In fact, Benicia was originally going to be called Francisca, which was General or Comandante Vallejo's wife's name. But San Francisco had just renamed itself from Yerba Buena to San Francisco after St. Francis. And so the comparisons were too close. And so they decided on her middle name, which was Benicia. Mm-hmm. So you can see, even with naming conventions, that these were competitions for each other. And you could make a lot of money out of this competition. Benicia ends up becoming a very powerful military installation during the Civil War. Robert E. Lee was even stationed there for a time. And then during World War II, World War I and World War II. So, yeah.
Brother Adam, our time is drawing rapidly to a close. I see two more hands. Perhaps we could stretch our time to allow these two final questions. And one is Brother Jap Sadalek, and the other is Brother Christian Torres. So,
okay, thank you.
Adam, thank you very much for a most interesting presentation. Maybe you remember we met each other last time several years ago at the AMLA conference in Bayreuth in Germany.
Yes.
But
yes, hi.
Nice to see you. Nice to hear you again.
See you. Yeah.
I have just a short question. If there was such a large Jewish community in California, wasn't there a Brit lodge, and was probably Hayam a member of it?
You caught me there. I don't know when B'nai B'rith was formed. If anybody has
New
that
York,
answer.
8040, 8050, I thought.
Okay. So it would have been a very brand new organization. Likely, they might have had some B'nai B'rith lodge there. I have not checked. When I expand this into a book, these are the avenues I must get into because the records may be there. So that's a very, very good question. Also, it's a small community, though. There are only 2 synagogues at this time in San Francisco. So, and many of the members of the congregations are largely what we call 48ers. A lot of the Germans that came over in 1848 and made their way across the United States into California for the gold rush, etc. So that's the largest population of the Jewish community, and there are others. But it's a good question. I will look at that because it makes sense. And also, there's 2 congregations, so they're meeting each other through these 2 congregations. And these 2 congregations, I must say, also still exist. They've been pillars of the San Francisco community.
Thank you, and good luck with further research.
Thank you very much. Good to see you.
It looks like our last one is Brother Torres. Who's up?
Yes, thank you, brother. No, just I didn't want to make a question. I just wanted to compliment what you were saying about the gold rush time. In 1850s, we'll have a very large population in San Francisco of Chileans, people coming from because Chile has always been a mining country and still is to this day. So, me being a Chilean, I can tell you that we had about 20,000 people there. So it was like one of the largest population at the beginning of the gold rush, and after that it faded away. But I'm not aware if there are any Masonic records of that time. But it should be interesting to know. Thank you, brother.
Yeah, thank you. And what you said is important. There were many Chileans, many Peruvians, many Argentinians, anybody who had experience with mining. Certainly in Chile, there were a lot of mining going on, and so they came up to California. In fact, it was faster to come from South America and even China to California than it was from New York. So it took about 3 months for the New Yorkers to get there, but the Chileans and other South Americans found their way there within a matter of a month or less. The issue we have is because of there's a few issues. One is people coming into the areas and making it rich quick and leaving. There was a lot of just in and out. There was also, and it's one of those kind of low points in the gold rush, a lot of prejudice from the Americans against others that were there, particularly the Chinese and also the Mexican, Central, and South Americans. And so they, in order to discourage what they called foreign mining, they concocted a foreign miners tax that basically made it even more expensive to mine unless you were a Anglo-American or Protestant American. It basically effectively kicking people off of their claims, forcing many of them to work as hands for a smaller share, right? So that happened too. And then because of these temporary landings and mining towns, diggings as they were called, there were many fires. Many of them were temporary, so there aren't a lot of records for that. For if there were any Chilean brothers coming in, we don't have the records of it. And certainly with the California Grand Lodge, with the exception of a few of these foreign language lodges, there just weren't any other records. And there may have been, though, not to say that there weren't. The fire of '06 wiped it out. We may never know.
Well, Adam, our time is brought to a close. On behalf of all of our participants, I want to thank you for sharing this with us. Just as a parting comment, your background that you have chosen, your virtual background, is
yes, I forgot about that.
Interior of Benicia Lodge number 5, and
yep.
Building is our oldest building in California, still in use. And of course, you mentioned that in your earlier lecture. So over your shoulder could have been the place where Benjamin Hyam presided as master of Benicia Lodge number 5. Thank you so much for all of your contribution.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. As a parting word, I think also this, as John said, this looks very much like this is exactly what it would have looked like to Benjamin Hyam. In fact, there's a legend that he haunts the place. People have seen him walking around. So thank you so much, John. I really appreciate you. It's an honor to have you do this. And I really appreciate everybody taking time out of their Saturday morning and evening and everything. And I wish you the best and health and wealth.